Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think at the beginning of that answer you said that we'll get an answer for a date of reopening sometime this summer. Can I push you for a clear date when you'll be announcing the date that the bridge can be reopened, please?
I can't be more specific because TfL is doing the ongoing investigation work. They're also doing the work required in relation to design and preferred option. They think it will be done this summer. They're going as fast as they can. They're working closely with the council to do this work.
Can I ask you to review who was responsible for the bridge being closed initially? Because you'll know from previous questions I've asked you, this has been on the agenda for a long time, and I think there's been a bit of ping-pong between TfL and the council. Do you agree with me the very fact the bridge has closed represents a failure of management?
Not at all. It represents the reality of an old bridge being used in modern times and the bridge not being able to cope with the number of vehicles using the bridge. And what's happened is the regime was put in place for there to be regular inspections. Those regular inspections discovered a crack for very good reasons. The council took the decision to close it. TfL supports that. This bridge takes more than 20,000 vehicles every day, including 1,000 buses. It was never designed for that.
And could I urge a sense of urgency, because it's not everybody who can walk and cycle. Yesterday I was down at the bridge and residents were saying to me that they have friends in sheltered accommodation one side of the bridge who feel they're trapped in their homes because of their age, that they can't cycle, they can't walk the distances, they can't even get to the revised bus stops. What do you say to those kind of residents, and how can we really speed up at least the partial reopening of this bridge?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real concern. That's one of the reasons why TfL have announced the rerouting of the buses, and they'll continue to monitor this. As far as the bridge opening, that will be determined by the advice received from the engineers carrying out the work they're carrying out. That work's got to be carried out. We've got to make sure the bridge is safe. The Assembly member will be aware there have been weight restrictions put in place for some time. There have been marshals there as well as gating to make sure not more than one bus goes over the bridge at a time. Double-decker buses stopped using that bridge some time ago. There was some reinforcement work done in the past. TfL have spent in the recent past £5 million in enforcements, in bus enforcements, ongoing investigations. They're currently spending between £3 and £4 million to try and make sure the work can be undertaken so we can find out what needs to be done to reopen the bridge, what are the options, what are the costs and how we do it.
Thank you. And just one final point. Could we review the consultation, the communication policy during this process? Because in the last week it's not been bad, but before that, for literally 25 to 30 days, neither myself, the constituency MPs or the councils were getting much information from TfL at all, but things have sped up in the last week.
Sorry, is that actually the buses?
The buses and the whole what's actually happened, what are you doing? We got no communication whatsoever, despite writing to you and to TfL. But in the last week or so, it has improved.
John, what I say is the bridge is owned by the council. TfL is working with the council. I'll make sure that TfL contacts the Assembly member in relation to buses and rerouting, but also I'll ask TfL to speak to the council about improving comms if there's an issue about comms, because local residents and businesses need to know what's going on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Deputy Chair Arbour.
I wonder, Mr. Mayor, if you can tell us how much TfL has in its reserves.
Not to hand, but I can write to you and give that information.
Okay. Would you agree that the figure is in excess of £1.5 billion? Okay. Well, I've looked at it and overall. Do you think an appropriate use for reserves is to deal with emergencies?
It is, except for unless the reserves are earmarked. But in general terms, reserves can be used for emergencies. I think TfL's reserves may be what's prudently advised to keep in reserves, but I need to check.
Yes, you're right. Much of the reserves are earmarked. Do you not think that the closure of a bridge is an emergency?
It is. I think the particular problem with this bridge, Deputy Chair, is it's not owned by TfL, and there are accounting rules in relation to use of capital monies. So, for example, one of the things that TfL can't do is use capital monies for something not in its control. You probably know accounting rules better than I do, and that's one of the reasons why in the past it's been revenues that have been used to improve the bridge and repair the bridge. That's one of the things that TfL are grappling with, is the the accounting rules and the use of monies.
On the 11th of April, Assemblymember Devenish and I wrote to you and suggested that the closure of this bridge was force majeure, and in the light of that, you should step in and take action and settle how the matter is going to be dealt with in relation to the arrangements with Hammersmith and Fulham. We haven't had a reply to that letter. Do you not agree that this is force majeure, and under those circumstances it is appropriate for you, who are responsible, if you like, for strategic matters in London, should step in?
Well, I think we'll be very careful how one defines force majeure. I mean, some things are outside of our control, and we're going to be very careful setting precedents. I'm more than happy to look into why you've not received a response, but the bridge isn't owned by City Hall, it's owned by the council, and there are other examples where there are big problems in relation to things owned by third parties where we'd be reluctant to step in. We've got to be very careful not stepping in, but we're more than happy.
No, Mr. That's like how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. My constituents in Barnes and Assembly Members Devenish's constituents in Hammersmith, and I would suggest actually this has a knock-on effect right across London, the closure of this bridge. That's no answer to those people to say, it's not me, Gov, it's Hammersmith and Fulham's fault. What you ought to be doing, if I may suggest with a great humility, is that you should say to Hammersmith and Fulham, this really is existential for people in West London, and the thing needs to be made good. And what we will do is, because TfL have the expertise, it's not that TfL haven't known about this problem, and indeed you've listed in your initial answer to Assemblymember Devenish the number of times that works has needed to be carried out on the bridge in recent years. So this can't have come as something where TfL hasn't had some kind of knowledge that this might happen. In effect, what I'm saying is you ought to behave like a statesman. You shouldn't behave like a borough leader. You should be speaking for the whole of London, and you should step in and say, we will do this, we will marshal the resources of Transport for London and get this job done and pay for it afterwards and see who is appropriate. If I can suggest an analogy with this is, for example, after a major rail accident, which is an emergency, and indeed I would say conceivably could invoke force majeure, I cannot believe for one moment that you wouldn't step in. Let us suppose the accident has happened by a TfL bridge or something of that sort, and see that the work is done and direct all those resources accordingly. Can I please ask you, will you act as a London-wide statesman and do this work?
Well, it's a long question, but let me deal with the number of points raised. There's a presumption made in your question that TfL are failing to help the council. That's not true. So, as I've said, TfL is currently paying for the expert work being undertaken to see the scale of the work required. TfL is paying for the engineering work, TfL is paying for the ongoing investigation work, TfL is paying for the design work required, and TfL is paying for the options that will come forward. The separate issue is the issue of who pays for the bridge to be repaired. We've not arrived there yet. So let's first do the work in relation to what the options are, what the cost is going to be, and then we can discuss who will pay for the bridge to be repaired.
Honestly, Mr. Mayor, this isn't an argument, it ought not to be an argument about who pays. That's a matter which can be dealt with instantly, eventually. The real problem is what is happening now. The enormous delays which are being caused, the excess pollution. I'm sure that Assemblymember Cooper is very unhappy about the excess amount of traffic which is going through Putney, which in fact is undoing all the good work which has happened because of the anti-pollution work that you have carried out under different measures. I would suggest to you that the daily costs of this measured in every conceivable way, does point to an emergency, does point to a crisis, And in a crisis, as the kind that I've explained, like after a rail crash or something like that, you move heaven and earth to do something about it. You don't argue about who pays and how it's going to pay. You say this needs to be done.
But
you cannot deny, Mr. Mayor, that TfL actually has the physical resources to do this. And I would say that it's a kind of insult, as you indicated to Assembly Member Devenish, to say we haven't even got a date, to tell you the date when we might be finding a date to do the work.
Well, Chair, I think the Assembly Member is, for the purposes of a different audience, not the one here, making points that I didn't say. I've been quite clear. TfL has moved as fast as we can to do the work required, to see what's required to reopen the bridge. The Assembly Member is assuming the bridge can be reopened in days or weeks. I'm making the point we don't know until the work's undertaken by the engineers, and the engineers are working extremely hard. And yes, I'm not going to hesitate from advertising the fact TfL is paying for this, because we don't care about where the responsibility lies. We're paying for this work undertaken. And so to criticise, as the Assembly Member is trying to do, I think, either me or TfL for not moving quickly enough it's just not fair, because TfL have been moving on this for some time, working with the Council in relation to paying for some of the work in the gating and the marshalling, paying for the work undertaken now, and are going as fast as they can to see what's required, and then I'm sure we'll move as fast as they can to get the work that are required to be done to open the bridge as soon as you possibly can.
Okay,
But I don't see how they can possibly do so without understanding the scale of the challenge.
Okay, I think the point has been made. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you both for that.